On a wet and dreary morning in 1915, 2,500 people boarded the SS Eastland, excited for a fun day out. It was the day of the Western Electric Employee Picnic, and it was to be spectacular, with parades and games for the children, and even a beauty pageant. The atmosphere on board was merry, electric. Soon the ship would cast off, and the picnic goers would be on their way to Michigan City. Or so they thought, but the ship, it began to tilt. Merriment turned into blind panic as the SS Eastland, still tied to its dock, capsized. Thousands of men, women and children frantically fought for their lives as they found themselves flung into the Chicago River, or trapped inside the overturned ship. Within minutes, hundreds of lives were lost, yet it's a disaster that's sadly faded into obscurity. This is the tragic story of the SS Eastland. 13-year-old Bobby and her little sister Solveig could not contain their excitement. They tried to sleep, but they just couldn't. Tomorrow was a big day. They'd be going on a trip for their Uncle Olaf's employee picnic.
Ooh, I love a picnic. I make the best imp tail sandwiches.
I think I'll pass.
Your loss, it's a delicacy.
Yeah, it's still a no. Bobby already had her outfit all picked out. She would wear the most beautiful white dress. Her mother had gifted it to her for Easter. And she would complete the fashionable ensemble with a wide-brimmed hat, decorated with delicate paper flowers. The Uncle Olaf worked at the Hawthorne plant of Western Electric, an absolutely mammoth company, specialising in communications technology. In particular, a fancy new luxury that you just might have heard of, the telephone. By 1913, it was the biggest company in Chicago, with over 14,000 employees, most of them immigrants from Eastern Europe, and many of them women. Now, this was actually quite a clever business move. You see, women, they made for very valuable employees. They were paid less, so they were a great way of getting cheap labour, and their natural delicacy of touch and carefulness apparently made them perfect for tasks like core winding and braiding. Now, the company picnic was the event to be at. It was a chance for employees and their families to dress to their nines, and for singles to mingle and maybe even meet their match. Each year it would get bigger and more extravagant. There would be parades, games, beauty pageants and a costume competition. Everyone would be there, from assembly line workers all the way up to managers, and if you didn't go, well, you might just find yourself without a job. This year, over 7,000 tickets had been sold. In neighbourhoods in and around the city, employees were excitedly making preparations. Swimsuits, toys for the children, parasols and picnic blankets were all at the ready. Picnic hampers would be filled with all kinds of tasty treats, chocolate cakes, luncheon meats and pickles, to name a few. Not everyone was excited though. Some were filled with a feeling of dread, a feeling that something would happen to the boat. Nightmares, dreams, visions of a ship turned over on its side and hundreds of corpses lying in a row.
Wow, what an oddly specific vision.
I know, very, very creepy. The day had finally arrived, Saturday the 24th of July, 1915. It was grey, dreary and wet. Bobby and her little sister Solveig began to get ready, putting on their beautiful dresses and fixing their hair. Their mother, Marianne, was busy in the kitchen, finishing off making breakfast, while Uncle Olaf adjusted his tie. He was looking very dapper in a smart suit and a straw boater. Like many other families, they soon began making their way down to the Chicago River. Here, a choice of 5 ships would be waiting to whisk them away to the picnic grounds in Michigan City. The SS Eastland would be leaving first at 7:30 a.m. sharp. This was the ship to catch for those wanting an early start on the festivities. The 3 Polivka sisters, Josephine, May and Anna, rushed to get ready. They were running late, you see. The trio, all dressed in white, had an important role to play in the picnic. They would be part of the parade. They quickly said goodbye to their mother and hurriedly made their way to 25th Place, where their friends, the 3 Zastera sisters, lived. Mrs. Zastera opened the door. "You girls are late. My girls left a long time ago," she said. The Polivka sisters then rushed off to catch a streetcar. They hoped that they'd arrive in time to meet their friends on the boat. By 6:30 a.m, thousands of people had gathered by Water Street, which was just outside the Eastland's dock. The ship was a sight to see. It sat proudly on the water, its white painted steel a striking contrast to the grey, dreary weather. It was enormous, the length of an entire block, about 5 stories high. At only 38 feet wide though, it seemed very, very narrow. Captain Harry Peterson and the chief engineer, Joseph Eriksson, made sure that the Eastland was all ready for boarding. Joseph had emptied out the ballast tanks, which was the usual protocol on the ship, while Harry reviewed all the charts and maps for the journey ahead. Boarding started at around 6:40 a.m. "Tickets please," shouted the federal inspectors. They used handheld clickers to count each passenger as they made their way across the gangplank and onto the ship. There was a steady stream of merry picnic goers, around 50 a minute, which meant that the 4 decks of the Eastland were filling up quickly. The gangplank began to dip, just a little at first, but it was becoming more and more noticeable. The ship was tilting toward the dock. The captain and the chief engineer, they weren't worried though. This was normal for the Eastland. She was like a bicycle, a bit unsteady until she got going. "Boys, steady her up a little," Joseph called out. The crew opened up the valves on the ballast tank closest to the river, the opposite side to the lean. River water rushed into the tank, and the extra weight soon balanced out the ship. Now, operating the ballast system was a bit of a guessing game. There were no gauges, so you had to guess how much water had entered the tank based on how long the valves had been open for. The Polivka sisters arrived in time to catch the Eastland. "May! May!" a voice called out. It was May's boss. "Why don't you all come and join us on the main deck?" he asked. They followed him onto the deck, but it was heaving, not a single seat in sight. So they decided to make their way to the upper decks instead, still keeping a lookout for their friends the Zesteras. Bobby and her family boarded the Eastland too. Making their way through crowds of people, they finally found 4 fold-out chairs to sit on. I don't like the feel of it," Marianne said. Bobby could barely hear her mum over the excited chatter of the other passengers and the music coming from the band. "What was that, Mum?" she asked. I don't like the feel of this boat. There are too many people on it, it feels top-heavy," her mum replied. The Eastland began to tilt towards the river, and once again Joseph and the crew righted it. Now Marianne, she knew boats. Her father was a Norwegian fisherman who often took her out sailing. It was in her blood. She loved being out on the water. But the Eastland, it just didn't feel right. And that concern, it definitely wasn't misplaced. You see, what the picnic goers didn't know was that the Eastland had quite a turbulent past. She was commissioned by the Michigan Steamship Company, who wanted a fast ship capable of carrying some freight and also 500 passengers. She was designed and built by the Jenks Shipbuilding Company. They'd never built a passenger ship before. Freighters were their speciality. Freight is stationary and usually stored in the holds, low down in the ship, whereas passengers, they like to move around and tend to cluster on the upper decks. A completely different weight distribution. The designer, Sidney Jenks, well, he was a bit out of his depth with this project. He kept having to go back to his old college professor for help, but eventually they had a falling out, so Sidney had to continue with the design, all by himself. The Eastland launched with great fanfare in 1903. It was quite the event. 6,000 people turned up. Crowds cheered as she entered the water, but the cheers soon turned to gasps. She rolled over 45 degrees. It was a tense moment. Thankfully, she came right back up, just as nice and steady as a church, recalled Sidney Jenks. In 1904, she would nearly capsize, with around 2,300 passengers on board. The ship seesawed for a whole 25 minutes. Passengers were drenched as water rushed in from the lake. Screams filled the air and people fell to their knees in prayer. Then in 1907, she nearly capsized again. Over the years, she changed hands many times. She was a top-heavy ship, and her stability problems would only get worse. The sinking of the Titanic gave rise to the lifeboats for all movement. Now, there were warnings that the extra weight from more lifeboats would cause ships on the Great Lakes to become too top-heavy. They'd be at risk of turning turtle. Legislators didn't listen though, and the Seamen's Act was passed in March 1915. So, not long before the Western Electric picnic, 3 additional lifeboats and 6 rafts were added to the Eastland, and these things are heavy, adding around 10 to 14 tonnes of weight. The extra lifeboats had been added so that the Eastland's passenger capacity could be increased to 2,500. More passengers, more profit. 2,000 more than the designer Sidney Jenks had in mind all those years ago, and 300 more than Chief Engineer Joseph was expecting. No one had told him that the passenger count had been raised, likely a critical piece of information for someone in charge of balancing the ship. The Eastland was designed to carry 6 lifeboats, and she was now carrying 11 lifeboats and 37 rafts, all on her hurricane deck. Now, as if that wasn't bad enough, 2 inches of concrete had been added to replace some of the rotten wooden flooring, resulting in an extra 30 to 60 tonnes of weight. Even after all these changes, not a single stability test had been carried out. Stability tests weren't mandatory, so why bother? The Eastland had been getting more and more top-heavy, and it certainly hadn't been designed for so many passengers. Marianne's gut feeling was 100% right. Joseph was working hard to get the ship balanced. It was tilting towards the river again. He turned on the engines to see if that would help and adjusted the water ballast. He succeeded. The ship straightened up. The harbour master, Adam Weckler, had been watching the Eastland intently. She was now at an even keel, ready for departure. He shouted up to the captain, "When you're ready, you can have the bridge anytime you want it." The harbour master's job was to raise the street bridges on the Chicago River so that ships could pass. The tugboat called the Kenosha got in position to guide the Eastland out onto Lake Michigan. By 7:10 a.m, the 2,500 passenger capacity had now been reached. "That is all," called out the federal inspectors. One picnic goer, E.W. Sladkey, arrived just as the gangplank was being pulled in. He could hear his name being called. He looked up at the ship, and there were his friends, waving at him and telling him to jump on. So he did. He made it onto the Eastland, taking the passenger count to 2,501. The captain started making all the preparations for departure. The annoying drizzle turned into rain, and it was getting heavier by the minute. Passengers started going down to the lower decks to keep dry. Sadly, this was a decision that would prove fatal. The Eastland tilted again towards the river. The ship leaned even more. The passengers thought all the swaying was good fun. They slid around on the dance floor laughing and shouting, "All together, hey!" as they slid one way and then the other. Bobby was trying really hard not to worry about what her mum had said. I mean, the ship must be safe. No one else seemed to be panicking. But it would turn out that others were worried too. The harbour master, Adam, sensed that something wasn't right. He called out to the captain, "Cap, I will not allow you to cast off until you have this boat trimmed." Joseph was also beginning to panic. Why wasn't the water ballast fixing the lean? What on earth was going on? A coffee cup slid off a shelf. Joseph had to do something, and quickly. He ordered the engines to be shut off. Maybe the list was something to do with the distribution of passengers on the main deck. He decided to send an engineer up to ask them to move to the starboard side of the boat. They calmly complied, but the ship still leaned. Then came the horrifying cry, "Water's coming in!" The crowd began to panic, quickly moving away from the open gangways as water rippled across the floor. In the engine room, water was coming in too. A lot of water. One of the engineers sounded an alarm called the Modoc whistle, but the captain either didn't hear it or chose to ignore it. He sent the standby command down to the engine room. Now, Adam, the harbour master, he really didn't like what he was seeing. He rushed down to the tugboat operator. "Don't pull on her at all. I'm not going to give that fellow the bridge until he straightens her up." Captain Peterson didn't hear this warning either. He still thought that he had the okay for departure. He gave a signal for the stern lines holding the Eastland to the dock to be released. The dockhand cast them off. Then he heard shouting and the sound of quickened footsteps. It was Adam. "Stop, stop, don't cast off any more lines." At 7:25 a.m, the ship once again righted itself, lulling everyone into to a false sense of security. The water rushed back out, the band began to play again, and dancers continued to dance. Then, at 7:27 a.m, the ship began its final, deadly bliss. 15 degrees, 25 degrees, 35 degrees. Joseph made a horrifying discovery. Ballast tanks 4 and 5, they weren't filling. That intake valve had a history of problems. The strain on the remaining lines holding the ship to the dock was immense. How much longer could they possibly hold? Water was rushing in. Plates, bottles and glasses crashed to the floor. Laughter and merriment turned to silent panic. The hush was eerie. 45 degrees. The band stopped playing mid-song as the piano went careening across the deck. It was utter chaos. Anything that wasn't nailed down went flying. Furniture, picnic baskets, hats, parasols, buggies. People. There was a large crash as a refrigerator hurtled into the portside wall. Bobby's chair slid out from under her. She grabbed onto a banister and held her little sister tightly. People grabbed onto whatever they could to keep upright. On the upper deck, the Polivka sisters, Sladky, Captain Harry Peterson, and many others clung onto the railings, holding on for dear life. The railings were slippery from the rain, and some unlucky souls lost their grip, plunging into the river below. A reporter from the Chicago Herald stated that they were hurled off like so many ants being brushed from a table. Screams pierced the air. It was every man for himself. The strong tossed aside the weak. Men climbed over and trampled women. Mothers shrieked as they lost their grip on their babies. On the lower decks there was a stampede towards the grand staircase. It would become a death trap. 70 degrees. Some people jumped out of the gangway doors, landing on the dock or in the river. Others weren't so lucky and hit parts of the ship with a sickening thud. A reporter from the Chicago Herald stated that in an instant the surface of the river was black with struggling, crying, frightened, drowning humanity. We infants floated about like corks. Many couldn't swim and grabbed onto those that could, doing them both in the process. The beautiful outfits that passengers had so painstakingly picked out in the days before became as heavy as an anchor when wet. Soaking wet corsets, stockings and skirts dragged women down into the depths of the dark, murky water. The Eastland continued to roll until it was on its side, half in the water, half out. It was said that the boat just turned over like an egg in the water. The ship rolled over so quickly that there was no time to launch the lifeboats. People hanging on the starboard railings were able to climb over these and onto the side of the ship that was above the water. Sladky and Captain Harry Peterson were among these. The Polivka sisters were still holding on for dear life, trying not to let go. Hands reached up from out of the rising river, frantically grabbing at their legs. Finally, someone pulled their sisters up onto the side of the ship. They stood here, waiting with the crowds for a while, when some men in a rowboat called out to them. "Come on, girls, we're going to take you off. Just roll over our arms into the boat. You'll be safe." The men dropped them off along the side of the river. Inside the Eastland, everything was topsy-turvy. The walls were now the ceiling and the floor. Much of the crew in the engine room had fled a long time ago, but Joseph Eriksson, the chief engineer, well, he would prove to be quite the hero. He knew exactly what he had to do. He needed to make sure that the boilers didn't explode from the rush of cold river water. He stayed at his post in the engine room and turned on the injectors, bringing cold water slowly into the boilers, gradually lowering their temperature. His actions undoubtedly saved many, many lives. As the water began to reach his neck, he managed to reach safety through a porthole. Bobby and her family were trapped inside the cabin deck. It was quickly filling with the foul, sewage-laden river. Luckily, Bobby had learned to tread water some years earlier. Her friend Ernie Carlson had taught her. Uncle Olaf threw a life preserver to Bobby. She clung to it, managing to stay afloat. She could see her mum holding onto Solveig with one hand and the boat with the other. 20 feet above her was a porthole. Sunlight was streaming through. It filled her with hope. Uncle Olaf dived into the murky water several times, saving many men, women and children. By the end of the day, he had saved 27 lives. Out on the river, rescue efforts were already underway. There were police officers, firemen, divers, doctors and nurses, all working hard to save lives. Life preservers were tossed from nearby ships. The Kenosha tugboat had been positioned near the Eastland, making a bridge between the ship and the dock, allowing people to make their way to safety. Passers-by flung off their clothes and jumped in to save passengers. Others threw in anything that could float. Chicken coos, boxes, boards and ladders. Tragically, some of these objects hit people that were struggling in the river, knocking them out and sending them to a watery grave. One man had been pacing up and down the waterfront, contemplating ending things. He watched in horror as the terrible events unfolded, but in the disaster, he found a reason to live. He jumped into the river and saved 9 lives. Western Electric nurse Helen Repper arrived at the scene. They were already pulling them out from below when I got there, she recalled. Out of the water or through portholes. People were being dragged out, wet, bleeding and hysterical by scores. Passengers were brought to doctors who checked them for a pulse. If they found one, they'd call out for a pulmotor, an artificial respiration device. If they didn't, they'd utter the word gone. Each gone was a life lost. It was a word that was uttered far too many times that day. Nurse Repper worked tirelessly. She pulled people out of the water, administered first aid, and helped to resuscitate many passengers. When she heard that the nearby Iroquois hospital was severely understaffed, she rushed over there to help in any way that she could. She had 500 blankets ordered to keep the sopping wet passengers warm and dry, and she also helped to organise a makeshift treatment centre in the Reed Murdoch building that was nearby the Eastland. Police and firemen were sometimes struggling to get people out of the portholes. They were far too small for many adults. One Western Electric employee, F.G. Hubbard, had a brilliant idea. He called over some welders to help, but the police wouldn't let them through. Finally, after much protesting, the welders were let onto the hull, and they set to work making holes in the ship. "Hey, hey, stop that!" a voice yelled. It was Captain Harry Peterson, angry that the ship was being damaged. "I'm trying to save lives here, not be careful of the boat," shouted the welder, before getting back to work. The captain could see other rescue workers banging and hacking at the ship, trying to free survivors trapped inside. He tried to stop them, too.
What was wrong with this man?
Well, apparently he'd had the sense knocked out of him. He'd later blamed his actions on a head injury. Thousands of people were at the waterfront that day. They'd watched the tragedy unfold, and the captain's behaviour incensed them. They screamed and shouted at him. "Drown him!" one woman screeched. The police eventually arrested him, partly for his own safety. The crowd were ready to tear him to pieces. One man managed to sneak in a punch though, punched him right in the face.
Yeah, get him!
Word of the disaster started to spread, and 17-year-old Reggie Bowles sprung into action. He jumped on a motorcycle that he was in the middle of repairing and sped down to the river, a wrench still in his hand. He was a strong swimmer and he knew he'd be able to help, but a burly police officer wouldn't let him through. Something came over Reggie. While the police officer was distracted, he hit him over the head with his wrench, slipped through to the dock and jumped into the water. He worked tirelessly, saving lives and recovering bodies. Reggie became known as the human frog. He could hold his breath for 3 minutes and was an exceptional swimmer. The young man didn't know his limits though, and he still wanted to continue helping, despite the fatigue that washed over him and the way that his body ached. A police officer had to arrest him in order to save his life. Bobby called out to her uncle, "Uncle Olaf, help, help! Mum is falling." Marianne and Solveig had begun to sink beneath the water. Uncle Olaf was in the middle of trying to save another woman, but he let her go and rushed to his sister's aid. He brought Marianne and Solveig back up to the surface and positioned them safely. Bobby and her family were trapped for hours on end, but somehow they never gave up hope. Then there was a rope. A rope! Rescuers were lowering it down through the porthole above them. Relief and joy coursed through them. Finally, they were saved. Out on the river, the thrashing, splashing and screaming had turned to a still silence. The living had all been rescued, and there was now the gruesome task of recovering the dead. Nets were stretched across the river to stop bodies from drifting too far away. 848 people lost their lives that day, many of them women, many of them children. 844 passengers and 4 members of the crew. 22 entire families were completely wiped out. Fished out of the water with pikes and grappling hooks, the bodies were taken to morgues where they were laid out in rows of 85. The bodies were numbered and covered with blankets. Only their feet were exposed so that families could hopefully identify their loved ones from their shoes. The 28th of July would be a day of funerals in Chicago. So many people were scheduled to be buried. So many that there weren't enough hearses. Gravediggers worked round the clock, but they still couldn't keep up with the demand. The weather was sorrowful too. It rained and rained for days after the disaster. One woman raised her hand to the sky and said, "You cry, too." By the 29th of July, nearly all of the dead had been claimed, except for number 396, a young boy who had come to be known as Little Fella. 3 children hadn't seen their friend Willie for a few days, and they started to worry. They'd read an article about Little Fella in the papers, and they thought it sounded like their friend Willie. They bravely visited the funeral home that Little Fella had been taken to, and they recognised Willie immediately. He hadn't been claimed because his mother, father and sister had all perished in the disaster. The Polivka sisters made their way once more to 25th Place, the home of their friends, the Zastera sisters. Here the 3 Zastera sisters lay in caskets. Sadly, they didn't survive the disaster. Arriving late and having to go to the upper decks had saved the Polivka sisters. The Polivkas had been excited to walk Marie Zastera down the aisle at her upcoming wedding, but instead they were attending the funeral of the 3 sisters. Within days of the disaster, 7 inquiries had begun. The public needed answers. Who was to blame for this tragedy? The captain, chief engineer Joseph Eriksson, and 4 officers of the company that owned the Eastland were charged with conspiracy to operate an unsafe ship. Ultimately, though, no one was found guilty of any wrongdoing. Civil lawsuits raged on for over 2 decades following the disaster, and blame was pinned on Joseph Eriksson for improper operation of the ballast tanks. Sadly, he died of heart disease in 1919 and was unable to defend himself. He made for a very convenient fall guy. It's awful. Joseph was a hero who risked his life to stop the boilers from exploding. The ballast system was sluggish and ineffective. The owners knew this. The ship was top-heavy, unstable, and there were too many passengers on board. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Joseph did the best that he could with the information and resources he was given. The Eastland would eventually receive new life under the name the USS Wilmette. She was sold to the US Navy, where she was used as a training ship for many years. Now, this tragedy, it isn't as well remembered as the Titanic, and some speculate that this is because it's a disaster that affected ordinary working people. There was no one rich or famous on board. In addition to a plaque near the site of the disaster, the stories of the victims, survivors and heroes are kept alive through the Eastland Disaster Historical Society. Their stories certainly deserve to be remembered. So many lives were lost and nobody did any jail time or paid any fines for what happened, and it's truly, truly heartbreaking. But there is a silver lining, a positive, lasting legacy. The tragedy, well, it sparked regulatory change. There have been great improvements to the regulations governing the inspection and certification of US passenger vessels. Improvements that hopefully mean that such a disaster will never happen again in the US. If you got something from this video, Gagi and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe. Remember, always trust your gut instinct. It's normally right. And I hope you have a magnificent day. 17 degrees.